Somewhere in the canyon country of the American Southwest, there are buildings that have stood empty for 800 years. 5-story sandstone structures with 800 rooms, their walls still standing, their alignment so precise that only on the spring and autumn equinoxes does the rising sun track perfectly along the exterior face of the largest building. Roads 30 feet wide, cut into living rock, running in geometrically straight lines across hundreds of miles of desert, ignoring ravines and hills as if whoever built them had decided that the terrain simply did not have a vote. Ceremonial chambers, astronomical markers, a road system of at least 650 kilometers connecting outlying communities to a central hub with the organizational logic of a capital city. All of it abandoned within a few generations around 1200 AD. Never reoccupied. The textbook story that settled into place across the 20th century was a comfortable one. A peaceful farming civilization, the Anasazi, flourished in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest for roughly 1,000 years, built remarkable things, then faced a catastrophic drought, dispersed into the wider desert, and faded from history. Mysterious, tragic, resolved. Then ancient DNA was extracted from the bones they left behind, and almost every part of that story collapsed. I first came across the 2025 Nature study on a Tuesday afternoon, and I ended up sitting with it for about 3 hours, rereading the same section. A living tribe, a sovereign nation in New Mexico, still there about 170 miles from Chaco Canyon, had just used genetic science to prove what their oral history had been saying for centuries. The people who supposedly vanished had not vanished at all. They had moved, adapted, and kept telling the story of where they came from, and for roughly 100 years, archaeology had been politely not listening. The ancestral Puebloans were not who the textbooks said they were. The society was not what the textbooks said it was. And most unsettling of all, the science found something inside those bones that the comfortable, peaceful farmer's narrative had been papering over for decades. Once you know what it is, those empty great houses start to feel considerably less mysterious and considerably more disturbing. The name was always wrong. Before any of the archaeology or the genetics, the first thing worth knowing is that the name itself is a problem. Anasazi was codified into archaeological use in 1927 through the Pecos classification system, a framework for organizing southwestern prehistory developed by Alfred V. Kidder, who at the time was widely regarded as the Dean of American Southwestern Archaeology. The term had been introduced earlier by Richard Wetherell, a rancher and trader who in 1888 became the first Anglo-American known to have systematically explored the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado. Wetherell worked extensively with Navajo people. He knew what the word meant. He used it anyway. Anasazi is a Navajo word. Depending on the account, it translates as ancestors of our enemies, ancient enemy, or in a version offered by some Navajo speakers, something closer to primitive ones. The Navajo were applying it to the Pueblo people's ancestors, with whom the Navajo had a long and complicated relationship. Kidder adopted the term primarily in his own words because it was easier to use than creating a more precise technical designation, that is, to put it generously, a methodological standard that has not aged well. The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, whose ancestors are the people being described, have rejected the term for decades. The preferred designation is ancestral Puebloans, or ancestral Pueblo people. The terminology matters not as a semantic nicety, but because it encodes the central error in how this civilization was studied for most of the 20th century, by outsiders, with outsider frameworks, using an outsider name for someone else's grandparents. When the genetic research came along and overturned the standard account, the people who were most correct about the basic facts were the ones who had never been asked what they actually built. To understand what was lost and what was not lost, you need to understand what Chaco Canyon actually was, because Farming Village does not cover it. Chaco Canyon sits in the San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico. From roughly 900 AD onward, it became the center of something with no neat parallel in the conventional story of pre-Columbian North America. The great house called Pueblo Bonito, the largest structure in the canyon and the one that would later become central to the genetic investigation, had approximately 800 rooms arranged across 5 stories. It was the largest building in North America until the 19th century. The architecture was not accidental in its arrangement. Pueblo Bonito has one straight exterior wall that runs perfectly east to west. Only on the spring and autumn equinoxes does the sun rise and set at each end of that wall. An interior wall runs perfectly north to south. The ruins of at least 4 other great houses, Hungopavi, Sincletzen, Pueblo Alto, and Casa Rinconada, show the same kinds of solar alignments. Anasazi, an artist who first noticed these patterns in 1977 while documenting rock art, went on to spend decades with the Solstice Project mapping an astronomical system embedded across approximately 5,000 square kilometers of canyon country. The road network is where the story gets stranger. The ancestral Puebloans built at least 650 kilometers of roads radiating outward from Chaco Canyon. Some of these roads were 30 feet wide. They were cut directly into living rock in sections. They ran in straight lines that ignored topography entirely, crossing ravines on earthen ramps, climbing cliff sides rather than routing around them. I spent an afternoon trying to find a practical explanation for roads that wide running that straight in a landscape with no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals larger than a turkey. No satisfying answer emerged. The road's function was almost certainly not logistical in any conventional sense. The Great North Road makes the point precisely. It runs 50.5 kilometers aligned to true north, terminating at a Badlands canyon called Cuts Canyon that is not even visible from most of the road's length. There was no village at the end, no resource to extract. It points toward a dramatic landform and above that toward the celestial North Pole. The researchers who have studied it most carefully describe it as a cosmographic expression, a road built not to go somewhere but to mean something. Then there is Chimney Rock. This is an outlying great house 145 kilometers north of the canyon in what is now southern Colorado. It is positioned precisely where the full moon rises between 2 natural rock pillars during the maximum lunar standstill, an astronomical event that occurs once every 18.6 years. There is no agricultural advantage to this location, no defensive advantage. The site exists in order to observe a specific astronomical moment. Whoever decided to build a great house there at that precise coordinate had been watching the sky for at least 2 full 18.6-year cycles before they broke ground. That is a degree of institutional patience that does not fit the dispersed farmer's story. The people who built all of this transported approximately 200,000 timber beams, some from forests more than 75 kilometers away, across desert terrain, without wheels, without horses, without oxen, by hand. This was the most comprehensive pre-Columbian astronomical observation system documented in North America, and it was also, as it turned out, a seat of power, the dynasty in Room 33. In February 2017, a paper published in Nature Communications reframed everything. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from human remains found in an elite burial crypt at Pueblo Bonito, a room designated Room 33. What they found was not the genetic signature of a community burial. 9 individuals interred in that crypt shared identical mitochondrial genomes. The same maternal line all the way down. When the team analyzed nuclear genome data from 6 of the samples with the best DNA preservation, they found something more specific. Mother-daughter relationships, grandmother-grandson relationships, a traceable family tree running through one kinship group for generation after generation. University of Virginia archaeologist Stephen Plogg, one of the researchers on the project, stated it plainly. For the first time, we are saying that one kinship group controlled Pueblo Bonito for 300 years. This is the best evidence of a social hierarchy in the ancient Southwest. 330 years, roughly from 800 AD to 1130 AD, elite status and almost certainly political and religious authority passed through the maternal line at Pueblo Bonito. The people buried in Room 33 were not randomly prominent. They were a dynasty. Power tracked through mothers across 13 generations in a building aligned to the sun. Here is the detail that stopped me when I first read it. The same oral traditions that would eventually be confirmed by the 2025 genetic study, the ones kept by the Pueblo peoples, had always described Chaco Canyon as a center place, a seat of organized authority with a specific social hierarchy. Archaeology, for most of the 20th century, had been skeptical. The DNA from Room 33 confirmed that the oral history was more accurate than the academic consensus. The peaceful farming village model does not survive Room 33, the droughts and the exit. What ended it happened in 2 stages, and the gap between them is important. The first major climatic crisis hit the central San Juan Basin around 1130 to 1150 AD. Tree ring analysis reconstructed the precipitation record in detail. Not a single bad year, but a multi-year drought affecting both winter precipitation, which maize needs for germination, and summer monsoon rainfall, which it needs to keep growing. Most of the great houses in the Central Basin were vacated during this period. The dynasty in Room 33 had ended. The Chaco system, as archaeologists call the regional network of great houses and roads, collapsed. There was a partial recovery. Population shifted, reorganized, and then the second drought arrived between roughly 1275 and 1300. This time, the entire Four Corners region was abandoned. Stephen Lexon of the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History studied the migration patterns and concluded the movement was not a slow individual trickle. It looks like whole villages may have picked up and moved south together, not just a smattering of families, he said. It sure looks like everybody leaves in a hurry. The turkey bones confirmed it. A 2017 study published in PLOS One analyzed mitochondrial DNA from domestic turkey remains across the region. Prior to 1280, the turkeys in the northern Four Corners area carried one distinct genetic lineage. After 1280, an entirely different lineage appeared in the northern Rio Grande area to the south and east. That is the signature of a large-scale human migration. People do not leave their domestic animals behind when they move permanently. The turkeys went with them, which means the people went with the turkeys. The genetic trail from the birds matched the direction that the architectural evidence, the pottery sequences, and the stone tool traditions had already been pointing. The people moved southeast, into the valleys of the Rio Grande, into the communities of the northern Pueblo region, the violence nobody wanted to see. The drought explanation is real and well supported. It is also not the complete story. Christy G. Turner II was a physical anthropologist at Arizona State University who spent more than 3 decades examining skeletal remains from ancestral Puebloan sites across the Four Corners region. He first encountered remains he believed showed evidence of cannibalism in the late 1960s. By the time he and his wife Jacqueline Turner published their 1999 book, Man Corn, the title taken from a Nahuatl word for a specific kind of ritual violence, they had cataloged remains from 76 sites and approximately 286 individuals showing what they argued was evidence of cannibalism or related organized violence. The most methodologically important case was Cowboy Wash, a site in southwestern Colorado excavated in the mid-1990s. The remains of 7 people, men, women, and children, were found scattered across the floors of 2 pit houses, not in burial contexts. The bones showed cut marks consistent with defleshing. They showed burning. They showed a distinctive polish on the ends that appears when bones are stirred inside ceramic cooking vessels. Richard Marler, a biochemist at the University of Colorado, then did something that proved harder to argue with than skeletal analysis alone. His team tested a coprolite, preserved human feces, found in a hearth at the same Cowboy Wash site. The result came back positive for human myoglobin, a protein found only in muscle tissue. Someone had eaten human flesh at that site. The findings were published in Nature in 2000 and made the cannibalism hypothesis considerably more difficult to dismiss. 3 explanations circulated. Starvation cannibalism, which fits the drought timeline. Ritual cannibalism, possibly adopted from Mesoamerican religious practice, which some researchers tied to cult activity moving northward. And a third, more uncomfortable hypothesis. Organized violence by a coercive elite using terror as a tool of social control. Patricia Lambert of Utah State University and Brian Billman documented something significant about the timing. Evidence of cannibalism and extreme violence at multiple sites spikes sharply between 1130 and 1150, precisely the years of the first major Chaco collapse. Each site where this evidence appears was then abandoned. The pattern is not random, it looks organized. The 2017 genetics paper documenting an elite matrilineal dynasty running Pueblo Bonito for 330 years does not resolve this question. What it does is make the third hypothesis considerably harder to set aside. A hereditary ruling class with multi-generational political control is exactly the kind of structure from which systematic coercive violence can be administered. Whether the violence was defensive, offensive, ritual, or punitive is a question the bones cannot fully close. What the bones can tell you is that the same decades that saw the political system fracture also saw episodes of organized killing at a scale and with a signature that does not look like desperate hunger. They were here the entire time. On April 30th, 2025, a study published in the journal Nature settled, with the authority of genomic science, a question that the people it concerned had never actually been confused about. The study was unusual from the start because it was not initiated by a university department or a federal research grant. It was initiated by the Picuris Pueblo, a sovereign native nation in northern New Mexico located near Taos, approximately 170 miles east of Chaco Canyon. The Picuris had oral histories and cultural traditions explicitly linking them to Chaco Canyon. They had been maintaining those traditions for centuries. They wanted genetic confirmation, not because they doubted their own history, but because they needed scientific documentation to support ongoing conservation and land protection efforts related to Chaco Canyon and the broader ancestral Pueblo landscape. The tribe retained full control over the DNA data, the parameters of the research, and the decision of whether and how to publish. This matters because a 2017 study had extracted and published genomic data from Pueblo Bonito remains without consulting indigenous communities first, a controversy that generated significant friction between archaeologists and Pueblo peoples and that directly shaped how this new project was designed. The team took saliva swabs from 13 living members of Picuris Pueblo and sequenced their genomes. They compared those genomes with ancient DNA from 16 individuals buried at the Picuris Pueblo site between 1300 and 1500 AD, and with previously obtained genomes from individuals interred at Pueblo Bonito, Chaco Canyon. Tomás Pinati, a geneticist at the University of Copenhagen and the University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, led the genomic analysis. The result was unambiguous. Among all sampled populations, past and present, across the entire comparison dataset, the Picuris Pueblo individuals were the most closely related to the ancient inhabitants of Chaco Canyon. No other sampled population, living or historical, was genetically closer to the Pueblo Bonito burials than the people currently living 170 miles away, who had been keeping oral histories saying exactly this. Pinati noted that the genetic signal included very rare markers, found in very few populations worldwide, shared between the Picuris and the Chaco Canyon individuals, a finding that goes beyond general regional ancestry and points to a direct line of descent. Picuris Governor Wayne Yaza, who helped initiate the study, said, "The DNA could help us protect our heritage. Now we can say, this is ours, we need to protect it." That sentence contains a whole history. The oral tradition had been telling the correct story for hundreds of years. The academic consensus, the comfortable narrative of dispersal and disappearance, had been wrong in its most fundamental claim. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They walked 170 miles southeast, rebuilt their communities, maintained their language, kept their ceremonies, and continued telling stories about where they came from. Then in April 2025, a geneticist at a Danish university looked at their DNA and confirmed that every word of those stories was accurate, what the evidence actually shows. So here is where the evidence lands assembled together, the people we have called the Anasazi, who prefer the designation ancestral Puebloans, and whose living descendants prefer to speak for themselves, built a civilization in the Four Corners region that, by any reasonable measure, qualifies as one of the most architecturally and astronomically sophisticated pre-Columbian cultures in North America. They did so under a hereditary ruling structure, a matrilineal dynasty documented in bone and DNA, that governed from Pueblo Bonito for approximately 330 years. They tracked the equinoxes with their walls, the solstices with shadow daggers cut into stone, the 18.6-year lunar standstill with carefully positioned great houses, and the celestial north with a 50-kilometer road that went nowhere anyone needed to go. 2 severe droughts fractured that system, the first around 1130 to 1150, the second around 1275 to 1300. The archaeological and genetic evidence points to a migration that was fast and organized rather than gradual and individual. Villages moving together, carrying their domestic animals, their pottery traditions, their architectural knowledge, and their memory of where they came from. They moved southeast, into the Rio Grande Valley, into the communities that became the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico. The violence documented at sites like Cowboy Wash is real, biochemically confirmed, and still debated in terms of its ultimate cause. Whether it was hunger-driven, ritual, or political in origin, it happened in the same decades the political system was collapsing, and it left a pattern that does not look accidental. The question of exactly what was organized, by whom, and toward what end is one that the current evidence cannot close, which is an honest position, and considerably more interesting than the old peaceful farmer's answer, which was not honest at all. The 2025 Nature study, carried by the Picuris Pueblo, did something that rarely happens in the relationship between genomic science and indigenous communities. It confirmed oral tradition rather than contradicting it. It gave a living community a scientific instrument for protecting land they had been connected to for more than 1,000 years. And it demonstrated with the specificity of rare genetic markers that the story of the vanished civilization had only ever been wrong from the perspective of people who had not been asking the right communities the right questions. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They are still here, and they have been here the entire time, and they have been trying to tell anyone willing to listen exactly what happened. What I'm curious about, and what I would like to hear from you in the comments, is which other so-called vanished civilizations are waiting for the same correction. The ones where the oral history survived, the DNA has not been run yet, and the academic consensus went a different direction from the people who were actually there. There are more of those cases than most textbooks acknowledge. If this kind of history interests you, subscribe. There is considerably more where this came from.